How's it going, ladies and gents? My name's Andy, and today we're going to take a look at 7 NBA teams that never reached the finals in their franchise's history. For every team on the list, I'll also give a brief explanation of why they never got there. The order of my list is based on how long the franchise has been around, starting from the newest ones to the oldest ones. But before we start, I'd like to give a shout out to my sponsor, SeatGeek. SeatGeek is an app that aggregates ticket prices from all over the web to help you find the best deals for games, concerts, Broadway shows, and other events. The prices marked in green are good, while the ones in red are bad. I used the app to buy tickets to a Knicks game last year, and the process was very smooth. You can also see the view from your seats before you buy them, so that's awesome. Use my promo code ANDY at checkout to get $20 off your first purchase. Thank you to SeatGeek for sponsoring this video. Alright, let's get started. Number 7, the New Orleans Pelicans. The Pelicans are one of 3 teams on this list that never even made the conference finals. The history of this franchise actually started in 2003 when the old Charlotte Hornets became the New Orleans Hornets, but they were recognized as a brand new franchise when the Charlotte Bobcats became the new Charlotte Hornets. I don't know if that made sense, but basically this current franchise is relatively new. They've obviously had some great players like Chris Paul and David West, who led New Orleans to the playoffs multiple times. But the farthest they got was in 2008. In the 2008 Western Conference semifinals, New Orleans was led by a 23-year-old Chris Paul. Going up against the defending champion Spurs was no easy task, but at one point, New Orleans had a 3-2 series lead. Unfortunately, they lost the last 2 games and the series in 7. That was the best season they've ever had. During the Anthony Davis era, they reached the second round again, but lost again. Eventually, this team, led by Anthony Davis, will make at least one conference finals, I think, but the finals, probably not. Despite being one of the best players in the league, Davis does not have a great supporting cast. It's good, but in the Western Conference, you need more than that. Number 6, the Toronto Raptors. The Raptors have been around since 1996, one of the 2 teams that were created when the NBA expanded to Canada. In over 20 years of their history, they've had a lot of great players actually. From Vince Carter and T-Mac to Chris Bosh to DeMar DeRozan, Kyle Lowry. They've made the playoffs many times, but usually losing in the first or second round. In 2016, they made the conference finals, which was the farthest they've ever gotten. Now, the problem is, despite having some great players over the years, they were never considered as serious contenders. There was always somebody better than them. During the Vince Carter and the Chris Bosh era, neither of them had a great supporting cast, and Carter left the team on bad terms. During the Lowry and DeRozan era, they had a couple of playoff runs where they severely underperformed, like in 2014 and 2015, where they were expected to win but they lost in the first round in both years. Then, later on, from 2016 to 2018, they lost to the Cavs for 3 straight seasons. But now, it looks like they have the best chance they've ever had to reach the finals. LeBron is no longer in the East, and they've got Kawhi. They have a better chance to make it with Kawhi than any other player they've ever had. If Kawhi re-signs with Toronto and stays there, then they're going to have a real shot at making the finals for the next few years. And if that happens, I think they will. Out of every other team on this list, I think Toronto, as of right now, will be the first team to make the finals. Number 5, the Memphis Grizzlies. So, going back to 1996, the Vancouver Grizzlies was the other team that was created alongside the Raptors. Unfortunately for Vancouver, they didn't have the stars to keep them afloat. After 6 seasons of losing a ton of games, they were losing money and they were forced to relocate to Memphis. In the early days in Memphis, they had a good team. They got Pau Gasol from the 2001 draft, and he would make an immediate impact on the team. He led them to 3 straight playoff appearances from 2004 to 2006, but they all resulted in a first-round loss. And that was it. They were never serious contenders, and the Western Conference at that time was ridiculous. With the team they had no real shot at reaching the finals. Fast forward a couple years later, and in 2011, they had a whole different team. Their core included Zach Randolph, Marc Gasol, Mike Conley, Rudy Gay, and Tony Allen. This was the start of the grit and grind era, where the Grizzlies became known for their tough defense, slow pace, and grinding their way to wins. Between 2011 and around 2017-ish, they were a dark horse contender for a couple years there. They were never the favorites to win the championship or reach the finals in any season, except maybe 2013. That was the year they made the Western Conference Finals, and some thought they would beat the Spurs, but they ended up getting swept. In recent times, they've been transitioning into a semi-rebuilding era. With their main players getting injured or traded away, and the rest of the team being bad, they lost a lot of games. But they secured the 4th overall pick and drafted Jaren Jackson in 2018. Nowadays, they're nowhere near as good as before, and they're very far away from contending. Number 4, the Minnesota Timberwolves. The Wolves have been around since 1990, but they've really only had one era when they were contending in the playoffs. That was the Kevin Garnett era, and even then, nothing went right. By the early 2000s, everyone started to recognize KG as an all-time great, but his supporting cast was terrible, besides maybe Wally Szczerbiak. The major reason for this was because of Kevin McHale. For those who don't know, he was the Wolves GM for a couple of years, but he had that scandal with Joe Smith's contract. Basically, McHale had an under-the-table agreement with Joe Smith, which was against the NBA's rules. David Stern found out and severely punished the Wolves, as he took away 3 future first-round picks from the team. You know, a lot of people talk about how KG didn't have much help in Minnesota, but they don't know why. This is why. They could have used them to draft better players or trade them to get better players, but they couldn't because they lost them. Eventually, the Wolves would have a chance to reach the finals. In 2004, Garnett finally got some legit help. Sam Cassell and Latrell Sprewell joined the team, but unfortunately, they lost to the Lakers. In the conference finals, Cassell got injured, but either way, they were clearly outmatched. It's amazing to think about though. Garnett's best supporting cast on the Wolves included Cassell and Sprewell, who were both really old and in the twilight years of their careers. But even so, he still won MVP and led them to the conference finals. Imagine if he had a legit supporting cast for his entire prime. Honestly, he could have been the best power forward of all time. After that season, the Wolves didn't make the playoffs until 2018. As for the current Timberwolves, I don't think they'll reach the finals. They have a good team with young talent, but everything is uncertain and volatile. But just like the Grizzlies, it depends on their young talent. Anything is possible. Number 3, the Charlotte Hornets. Charlotte is interesting. Back in the 1990s, the original Charlotte Hornets were actually a really good team. But just like with every other Eastern Conference team in the 90s, they were not better than the Bulls. The Hornets were never legit contenders simply for the fact that the Chicago Bulls existed. And even if they didn't exist, the Hornets were still not better than the Pacers or the Knicks during the 90s. That's why they never even reached the conference finals. They also had a short era between 2000 and 2002 where they made the second round a couple of times, led by Baron Davis and Jamal Mashburn. But those teams were never gonna go that far. Fast forward a bit to the Bobcats era with Gerald Wallace, Steven Jackson, and then later on the Kemba Walker, Al Jefferson era, and it's pretty much the same thing. Even if they get back into the playoffs, this team isn't good enough to contend. A lot of it has to do with their draft picks. Over the years, they've had some really high picks, but nobody really developed the way they thought they would. This includes Michael Kidd-Gilchrist, Cody Zeller, Frank Kaminsky. They're nothing more than decent rotation players. Looking at the rest of the Eastern Conference, a lot of teams have great young talent, much more than Charlotte. Because of that, I don't see Charlotte contending anytime soon. Number 2, the Denver Nuggets. The Nuggets have been in the NBA for over 40 years, since 1977, and they still haven't made the finals. The problem they had was that their best era was during the 1980s. With guys like Alex English, Dan Issel, Kiki Vandeweghe, Fat Lever, they had some amazing teams in the 80s. But of course, we all know what was going on in the 80s. The Showtime Lakers were far ahead of anybody else in the West, for the most part. For 9 straight seasons, the Nuggets made the playoffs, but they only reached the conference finals in one season. That was in 1985, when they had arguably their best team ever, but they lost to the Lakers. A couple years after that era was over, the Nuggets made history in 1994. With a whole different team that nobody believed in, they pulled off the greatest upset in NBA history. They became the first ever 8 seed to beat the 1 seed in the playoffs. Fast forward about a decade later, and that was the start of the Carmelo Anthony era. While there was a lot of hype in the beginning, the Nuggets found themselves losing in the first round for 5 straight years. They just weren't good enough, and as I mentioned before, the Western Conference during that time was crazy. 2009 was their best chance, but they ran into Kobe, who was hungry for the championship. A couple years later, in 2013, they won 57 games without Melo, but that was the year they lost in the first round as Steph Curry made his playoff debut. Nowadays, they have a really bright future. Great chemistry, great young talent, who play really well together. As they improve and get older, I think the Nuggets will make the finals sometime in the next decade. Number 1, last but not least, the oldest franchise that has never reached the finals. It's none other than the Los Angeles Clippers. Even going all the way back to 1970 when they were still the Buffalo Braves, they still haven't made a single conference finals. The sad part is, they really only had 2 different eras where they were considered as a dark horse contender. The first was in the mid-70s with Bob McAdoo. McAdoo led the league in scoring for 3 straight seasons and won the MVP in 1975. But he could never lead Buffalo past the second round, mainly because he couldn't get past the Celtics. After that, and after the Clippers relocated several times, they were basically irrelevant for the next 35 years or so. In 2006, they had a glimmer of hope with Elton Brand having a career season, but there was no continuity with that team, it was just a flash in the pan. The Chris Paul, Blake Griffin era starting in 2011 had their best teams in franchise history. Unfortunately, as you all know, that era was marred with injuries, chokes, and overall the team underperformed in the playoffs. They had a couple of years, mainly 2014 and 2015, where they really could have made the conference finals. But in 2014 against OKC, they choked away the end of Game 5, and in 2015 against Houston, they blew a 3-1 lead. In the other years, CP3 or Griffin were plagued with injuries, so that was basically it. And that's all, folks. Those were 7 NBA teams that never reached the finals. Thank you all so much for watching, and if you liked it, don't forget to drop a like, subscribe, all that good stuff, and as always, I'll see you next time. Peace.